Welcome to the launch of the Community Consultation for Quality of Life project, which is a major Arts and Humanities Research Council research project to develop a new map-based model for community consultation. I'm Flora Samuel from the University of Reading, and I'm a trustee for the Quality of Life Foundation, who are major partners in this project. So I'll be chairing this session on how to make community consultation more useful. And it's the first of a series of talks and discussions organised by the Quality of Life Foundation, which in a way are part of the research of the projects. There'll be 4 themed discussions before Christmas, and then we're going to be moving to national discussions after the Christmas break. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jonny Anstead from Town, and who is a trustee on the Quality of Life Foundation, Ian Harvey from Civic Voice, and Eleri Thomas from Public Practice. And we'll be hearing more from them and getting into the discussion a bit later on. First of all, I'm going to be doing a little bit of give you a little bit of background on the project, to tell you what we're planning, and please don't hesitate. Anything we need to know about, this is all part of the research. Any comments, question, whatever, just please do put them in the chat. That's really very useful. Okay, so I always have a brain freeze on how to get to main screen. Okay, can you see that, everybody? Yep. Okay. Right. So community consultation for quality of life, as I mentioned, it's a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And in part, it's inspired by my experience of working in the UK Collaborative Housing Evidence Centre, which is also a supporter of the project, because I went around interviewing people about why we get average housing estates that we get. And I got this quote from a local development plan manager in Wales, and he said, in consultations, people will come in, they won't read any of the information that's there. It's just, I live here, is that site near my house? And then if you say no, they walk out. I've been doing this for 20 years. It's really quite depressing, because we're standing in a village hall all day and one man and his dog will come in. So coming from the professional perspective, and it's pretty meager experience, but it's also been my own personal experience as a member of my community, my street where I live, where we've been having constant planning battles with businesses in our area that we felt completely and totally disempowered. So I have to admit, I'm lacking in academic objectivity about this project, which I have to keep an eye out for, because as a citizen, I think it's really hard to engage. Okay, so I'm now trying to, managed to move on. So who are the investigators? Me, I'm the principal investigator. Lorraine Farrelly, my colleague at University of Reading, Mario McVicker at Cardiff University, Saul Golden, University of Ulster, John Brennan, Edinburgh University, and Ruchit, who is the research assistant, formerly from Participatory City, Matt and Morgan from the Quality of Life Foundation, and Mike Saunders and David Jana Klausner from the digital consultation platform Commonplace, and Stephanie Edwards from Urban Symbiotics. So it's a really amazing cross-industry, cross-university team. And what are our research questions? Being academics, we like a research question. How can community consultation be made more useful and effective across the diverse policy context of the UK? In a sense, that is the theme of the session today. But you can't really see that without the other research questions. How can it be made more representative and inclusive? A continuing and really thorny problem. How can community consultation be undertaken for areas not yet being developed, where the future users are not yet known? I know there's lots of different experience in that area, but it's a very hazy grey area. How far do you have to consult? So what are the relative benefits of online and physical community consultation? Something that hugely came up in the pandemic. What format should it take in a pandemic? As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, in many areas, community consultation evaporated during the pandemic early stages, and word on the street is that some dodgy projects got through during that stage when the community had no say in the matter. So how can community consultation be made into a long-term project that fosters ongoing civic debate? So community consultation tends to be consultation, that is by its very nature, a very stop-start event. And we don't collect the information from one consultation and build on it in another. Engagement is obviously a longer-term project, engaging with the community over a long-term period. And we use consultation here because we want consultation to be better. Consultation is a statutory requirement, but I think consultation and engagement are obviously clearly linked. And how can social value mapping inform the process of community consultation? And I'll talk a little bit about this technique of social value mapping that we've been developing over time. And also what terminology is needed to describe inclusive, empowering 21st century community consultation. Well, even the word community is hugely problematized by academics and others. And even within our group itself, we realize that there's so many, the terminology is deeply fuzzy and indeed tainted in some ways. And even words, for example, social value, they're meaningless to people who are not in sort of industry or thinking about social value. I should say I use social value fairly interchangeably with quality of life and indeed well-being. So we're going to be developing a taxonomy, a sort of a group of words which will be useful for finding information around community consultation. So in numbers, we've got 901K from the AHRC, plus considerable in-kind contributions. It's quite a big bid in arts and humanities research terms, but it's very tight for what we're trying to do. We've been running since July, and we're going through to December 2023. These are people who wrote letters of support, which had a very major role in getting the project onto the go. And we also had a whole range of local letters of support from the different national councils, capital city councils and local areas. So the project will employ a research assistant, that's Rootshit, 4 local community partnership managers, that's people from the community who will be employed to help bring us together closer with what's going on the ground, and 8 university research placements. So not a lot of stuff, but I think we'll add a lot of value through what's going on already in the scene. So you're probably aware of this whole emerging world of the urban room network, and it's a series of urban rooms. Most recently, the Farrell Centre in Newcastle is a famous one, have been set up for places for debate about the future of cities and places for academic, industry and practice research to come together with what people want. And we're going to be using urban rooms as the nexus of where our face-to-face research is going to be happening. And we set up this one at Sheffield, LiveWorks, which is, it's kind of shows what we have in mind in a disused shop. So mapping social value, this whole mapping process, we did develop the social value toolkit for architecture, which was a very simplified. We just tried to make it very simple for architects to think about how they generate social value through design. Social value is very much, up until recently, has been very much been about, during the construction phase, jobs and apprenticeships. But there's a really important world here, which I think the Quality of Life Foundation is really tapping into, about the social value delivered by the project itself in use. So we did a research project in which we worked with the local community on an estate in Reading on mapping their social value. This is not rocket science stuff, I should say, but it seems to have captured the imagination and is being replicated in various places. We use stickers, working with school kids, working with all sorts of communities to try and develop maps of what people want. Now, so how you deal with multilingualism in consultation, this is a really thorny question. That the school near our Welsh pilot project has got 37 languages going on in it. So it's a design exercise, how we develop the visuals and make it really intelligible for people to get involved. So we trialed these maps out with people and ended up with these maps of things like connection, where people felt connected to one another, where they took their exercise, where they took notice, for example, of nature, and where they had positive emotions around the place, and brought this together in a kind of heat map showing where social value was happening on this estate in Reading. And we could have indeed used these heat maps to measure the impact of one of the Reading Borough Council's decisions, which was to close a local swimming pool in this area. So this heat mapping process, which was very laborious and handmade, is something that we are now working to digitize, and really will digitize through this project. And we're working towards an idea about mapping, which is multi-layered, building on Ian McHarg's Designing with Nature back in the 70s, where we can map passive layers of data, things like indices of deprivation, mortality rates, things that come through the census, and everybody's excited about a new census set of data coming through quite soon. Passive layers of data, which can then be built up with an active social value layer of data, which is built with communities. So for those projects, we were using the UK Green Building Council's framework defining social value, which is based on triple bottom line approach: social, economic, environmental, triple bottom line of sustainability, which in other words, good design, good places. So you have to think of social as an increment of those three, but of course they are all deeply interconnected and happen at different scales. Now, the social value toolkit for architecture was a very simple tool that we developed, just really to start the conversation and to help get architects aware that they could be monetizing social value if they really had to. And personally, I don't think they should be monetizing it, but we know that many places monetizing is really key. The Quality of Life Foundation has since developed the Quality of Life framework, which I think is much more nuanced and interesting. And they've developed that with UrbEd, who are amazing urban design practice. So our maps for this project will be around control, health, nature, wonder, movement, and belonging. And that enables us to bring in really key facets to do with culture and identity and other more exciting intangible things. So another aspect of the project, so the Quality of Life Foundation have been working, developing work with Stantec, and I'm doing a research project with Stantec, who are a large global infrastructure firm and land decision-making firm for the Better Places Toolkit. And the aim of this is to help bring social value right to the very start of the decision-making process, where councils are making their local plans. So we're told that typically local plans are based around sustainability assessments and economic assessments, and that the social value really doesn't enter into the story too much. And I've certainly found that personally in my neighborhood where I live, where we've been having these planning battles, where we're constantly told, you can't do this because it's not the local plan. The local plan never considered what the community wanted. And then Cardiff is going through a new local planning phase at the moment. And it's a very big and complex area and very difficult for the community to enter into. So it's community consultation is not just about having a pilot, doing meeting people face to face, doing websites or whatever. It's also about the information that you give the community about the place in the first place. And the UK is supposed to be an open data place. But actually, research has shown that only 1 in 10 pieces of open data is actually humanly sort of intelligible to the population. So community consultation is not just about the pilot or the face-to-face consultation, it's also about the presentation of information that is intelligible to your average person and in the right language. Because in Cardiff, we've been asked questions like, what would you prefer, trees or housing? You can't make that decision without an overall strategic, holistic view of things. Now, maps are really key to Greater Manchester. It has done great work. They've got a whole mapping framework of this passive data, and you can go and look at their website and see this stuff. It hasn't quite yet been pulled together with regard to social value. So our vision is that these kinds of passive data repositories can be augmented with the social value community data. I know HACT has also got an amazing insight tool which brings together a lot of the passive data as well. So we're working with our partners Commonplace on mapping social value in the 4 pilot areas. And Commonplace have a very well-established tool for helping people to digitally engage and face-to-face in using maps, asking questions and putting their little tags on where things happen. And Commonplace are just they're updating their platform and making it much more sophisticated and exciting, which offers real opportunities for our project. So we're starting to think about what are the questions we would be asking, say, about Reading, where we are now. So all this has to be thought about in context in England, the context of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, building on the planning white paper, their prop tech engagement fund, where they're working with 12 local authorities. They've put out a call for 12 local authorities to be laying the foundations for the local public services of the future and thinking how digital technology, mapping and so on fit into this world. At the moment, many local authorities will have a community consultation hub, which is a very dry web page on their website, which will just tell you what are the consultations that are rolling up that particular month or whatever. But we have to make that much bit more engaging. So in Scotland, they have a whole digital planning strategy, which is incredibly exciting. As I'm just talking about it with colleagues in Scotland around the policy questions. Does what we're doing in planning actually show that we love the children in our country? Amazing questions around the word love. Anyway, I digress. But there's a digital planning system looking very, very large scale and to the hyperlocal. So envisaging that we are going to have this all across the UK, an amazing joined up digital planning system. And I point to this: regional planning is dead, long live planning regional futures. There's a lot of talk at the moment about adaptive planning, fluid planning. So I think the idea of having a local plan in 2021 and another in 2026 is going to be completely redundant very, very soon. You can see here, wicked problems, agile planning. We're going to be using digital maps on a constant real-time basis. And this fits into work about coding and the National Model Design Codes. I believe that we can be building environmental, social, economic codings into plans. So plan, what are we going to be doing with the project? We're going to be doing a literature review of best practice in the 4 nations of the UK, including expert interviews. If anybody wants to give us any hot tips on what we should be looking at, sling them in the chat. This is what we need to know. We're also doing a very academic, systematic literature review of all the refereed journal papers in this zone, but that doesn't tend to bring up the grey literature, industry literature. We're developing a map-based community consultation platform to be used face-to-face and online, being refined across the 4 pilots. We're developing programs of community capacity building in all 4 nations. We didn't really realize, there's much more to that than we thought. And we're making a community consultation format to be piloted and refined on live consultations in successive rooms in Reading, Cardiff, Edinburgh, and Belfast. And this is the Grangetown Pavilion in Cardiff, where we'll be doing the one in Wales. And I just was there this morning because, and I just show that as a live picture to show what a successful place. 9 in the morning, things are really happening, amazing diversity of people, just great. But in Reading, we're going to be we've had a competition with students, and a competition approach may be taken for the other ones. We're going to be building our urban room into a local shopping centre, Broad Street Mall, and possibility of having one of them in Edinburgh in Waverley Mall, which would be amazingly central and exciting. So what we're going to deliver, we're going to be delivering reports and community consultation for a policy and industry audience, including four national reports, which include deep case studies of best practice. So my plea to you is, if you've got any deep case studies of best practice, please, again, put them in the chat. We need to know about them. So what we're doing here is not tremendously original. It's going to be about pulling together good practice. And this is the foundation of what we're up to. We're going to make a guide for undertaking inclusive, ongoing, high social value community consultation across the UK, including guidance on building capacity with communities, complex issues like language use and so on. So we're going to be learning that in practice, and we're already learning, what a complex issue this is. And we're going to be developing a digital format for undertaking community consultation available from the Quality of Life Foundation website, developed as a service with Commonplace, which is very exciting. And we're also going to be developing what we're calling legacy maps for ongoing collection of community opinions in the pilot areas, those heat maps. We hope that they will carry on developing as, in a way, tools for democracy going forward. And of course, being academics, we have to do some academic outputs. So very brief run through of the ambitions of the project, which by its very nature has to be a consultation and a bit of community co-design. And so we're really excited to have these events, to learn more about what everybody's been up to, and to continue sharing and debating the knowledge about what is a really thorny issue, but a really critical issue for the future of the nation, really, because it all comes down to democracy ultimately, and how we see ourselves. And in the run-up to COP26, I believe that climate change is a social justice issue ultimately. So if people don't feel empowered and don't have a say, then it's very difficult for them to engage around issues around climate change. So thank you for your attention on that one. I am now going to invite my panelists, Jonny, Ian and Ellie, to reveal themselves if they can. Ian's been having some tech issues, but I thought I saw him a moment ago. I invite anyone who's on the audience, please sling questions, comments, examples into the box. We really want this to be as interactive as possible. So I'm just going to start off by asking Jonny, first on my screen, to introduce yourself a little bit and to talk about your experience of community consultation.
Sure. Thank you, Flora. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so a quick introduction. Jonny Anstead, one of the founding directors of Town. We're a property developer. We focus on housing development at different scales, from kind of good quality neighbourhood housing of 20 plus homes through to large new urban extensions of 5,000 homes plus, where we act more as master developer rather than as building all those homes. Yeah, that's who I am, and I've got quite a lot of experience, good and bad, in community engagement. Like probably most people here, I doubt anybody's got anything other than a mixed bag when it comes to their experiences of community engagement, because I think it is one of those things. It can be done tremendously badly and sometimes tremendously well. But over the last sort of 15, 16 years, I've sort of, I guess it's just been a core thing that I've been involved in one way or another. For a period of time, kind of fairly specialised in that sort of area, working for other people's developments, and then latterly in kind of like, batting for ourselves, as it were, and sort of, doing community engagement for things that we ourselves are proposing. So I've sort of had a bit of involvement through those different sort of parts of the picture, through kind of providing community involvement services through to, actually being the proposer. And I think there was a bit of a difference in kind of how there's a difference in those roles, because which I think is actually really important to the whole argument. Because as a developer, if you're if you want to bring a project forward, you're faced with a fraught load of questions around how you approach the questions of community involvement, as to how authentic you are, how much risk you take, how much you try and control the process, how worried you are about it. And I think that those kind of questions around commercialism and risk are really central to a lot of community engagement as to whether it's done badly or well. So I guess a few examples. I've been involved in engagement events where the developer sort of stands at an empty town hall with about 3 people coming through the door, and you kind of think, well, that's a big sort of failure. We haven't managed to talk to anybody. But maybe the developer says, phew, nobody turned up and harangued us, or there were no billboards outside protesting against the development. And you sort of think, well, maybe they didn't know that it was on. And it was like, yeah, but whichever, doesn't really matter. We kind of like got three people turned up and nobody was vehemently against it, so job done. And that kind of tremendously reductive, sort of like very narrow approach. I've been in events where the net has been sort of cast quite wide and tremendous participation, but where on the sort of proposer's side, there's been such a kind of wish to kind of almost control it and have a very kind of clear idea as to how things are going to go, but not very much appetite to really be clear with people about the parameters that you're engaging in. So kind of like, you know, events where people will stand up and say, look, we're at a tremendously early stage, it's a blank piece of paper, we just want to hear your ideas. And you kind of know that behind the scenes there's a really clear plan, and there's a commercial reality to the project, which just means that the idea of a fully blank piece of paper can't really be credible, and nobody really believes it, because how are developers like organizing a big event and inviting people along at this stage and haven't even done any homework on it to kind of like see what the parameters are? That just seems like ridiculous, and people sort of sniff that out. And you know, I think that those kinds of processes often go wrong. The kinds of events where they become heavily politicized, and I think that kind of politicization of engagement goes two ways. It can be developers getting it wrong and sort of thinking that the route through to success is by noveling some politicians, and you know that there's a whole industry in this country that exists to kind of do engagement on behalf of developers, which is all about kind of, you know, practices saying, you know, we know we have good relationships with the politicians locally. And I'm, you know, deeply dubious of that sort of like, again, very kind of simplistic way of looking at things, which isn't to say that politics isn't important. It's just, if you just look at things through a political dimension, I think that's your route through these processes, and you know, that just seems not great. But also on the other side, when some developers come forward with quite, you know, authentic and you know, decent sort of like, here we are, here's our proposals, some local politicians or would-be, you know, politicians, if you especially catching them at the wrong part of the cycle, you can suddenly find that you become on their, you know, you suddenly feature on their, you know, on their electoral leaflets as something to oppose. And then suddenly you're into the world of misinformation, and people don't really care about what you actually were putting forward. It's much more convenient if you want to get votes locally to say, you know, to sort of like, you know, make great claims, and sort of, you know, truth doesn't really come into it at that point. So I think this kind of whole politicization is something that plays in lots of ways, but can be very fraught. And I think the final thing, and then I'll come to a bit of a kind of some of the sort of like ways that we're taking this forward, is the kind of total lack of the diversity in the people who you end up talking to through processes. It's very easy to arrange an event and find that people with time on their hands, often older people who have retired, turn up to your events, but then of course you're talking to people who have very specific perspectives and probably own a home in an area where you're building new homes. And trying to get to people who aren't those groups of people is a real challenge, and that seems like one of the great challenges for all of us to look at. And I think then that it just means that we have to start looking at how we organize our engagement processes. And so for me, it's much more about thinking of engagement as not really as events. I think we've all tended in the past to think of engagement as being events, as if that's a kind of way, like no dialogue is successful if it's an event. Like it's like a kind of conversation without back and forth. It doesn't make any sense to have dialogue as a kind of incident. It's a process. So I think engagement has to start being thought about as processes. I think it would be much better if, when as developers we come forward, we're plugging into a much wider process, because often when we bring a dialogue forward, the first thing we might expect people to come back to us at is, hang on a second, you're proposing this, but why is there already congestion on that road? Or why aren't the bins aren't already even being collected? You're going to make the problem worse, sort of thing. And you suddenly realize that, you know, you're engaging into a context where there's a kind of total lack of usual engagement, and people aren't being engaged in anything day to day. So you're expected as a developer to come into this where people aren't used to it and have all sorts of concerns, which aren't your doing. You may or may not be making them worse, but the kind of level of conversation is sort of starting from that kind of, nobody's talked to us for the last 10 years, and now you're coming in and sort of like proposing all this change. And it'd be much better for everybody, I think, if there was a sort of like a kind of steady state of dialogue that we as developers could kind of plug into and be part of. And then I think it's like, you know, the gold mark would be if you manage to get you know, if you actually end up talking not only to people who live in a local area and where there's often kind of like levels of appeasement and sort of saying, you know, we're not going to cause too much harm, if you could actually talk to people who are going to be the real residents, who may or may not live in the local area already, but they've got an absolute stake in the conversation because they're going to be future residents, that would be a game changer. And it's really hard to do that because it's obviously a big unknown as to who will be living there, and it's not an easy thing to work out. At Marmalade Lane, I'm sure we can come back to this later, the big thing that was a game changer for us there was that we were working with 20 or 30 households, all of whom had committed to being part of that scheme up front. So it wasn't really kind of community consultation in the sense of, you know, the wider area, but it was absolutely community engagement in the sense of working in a co-design sort of process driven way with the people who would end up living there. And that just totally, you know, changed the dynamic altogether. And I think that the more you could kind of take bits of that and apply that to our kind of bigger processes of engagement, the better, because it's just more direct, it's more authentic, it's much more honest. And you recognize there are commercial realities, but there are also lived realities for people who are going to be living there. And the dialogue becomes all about how do we bring those things together in a way that's going to work for everyone. So that's my potted overview of some thoughts on it, but hopefully not too garbled, and some things to pick up in the conversation later, Flora. Thank you.
That's great. No, that's great, Jonny. So engagement is not about events. It's really about, I mean, it's about a long-term relationship, and that's what we're heading for in this project. Ellie, over to you.
Thanks, Flora. And just to check, can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, that's good news. Well, thanks, Flora, and Quality of Life Foundation as well for asking, well, public practice and me to join. So yeah, my name's Eleri Thomas, and I'm a current public practice associate at the London Borough of Newham. So for those who don't know, public practice, it's a non-profit enterprise which is kind of focused on building public sector capacity around quality places and equality and quality of places for everyone. So that's been a really fascinating experience for me. I'm 6 months into my role at Newham, and I'm working right across the council on a number of different projects, but with a focus on the sort of strategic early stage regeneration. So particularly focused around Stratford, and then also some work down at the Beckton Riverside. And that's brings up a number of things about kind of how we apply, you know, approaches to development and engagement and strategy and practice. And I think just reflect on that to say that up front, my sort of background in particular focus has always been in sort of the policy, strategy and research side of this. So I bring much less of the kind of on the ground day-to-day experience. So I'll nod over to my colleagues who have, like Jonny, who have that sort of on the ground experience of a client. But I think it's a lot of the work I've done in kind of looking at this from a sort of step back point of view has raised a lot of the kind of trends that we see across engagement projects right across the UK, and some of the sort of different ways of doing it. So hopefully that can sort of throw some light on some of what we also know are the real practical challenges of doing this. And just a reflection of my colleagues at the moment in Newham are developing the new local plan. They're doing about to embark on the initial engagement exercises through issues and options, and found myself in a conversation this morning and someone saying, well, it's not perfect, but we're trying as best we can. And I think that's really indicative, kind of, it's very difficult to get this perfect, but you know, the more we can kind of push to improve practices should be the kind of direction we go in, and be reflective in that. Because I don't think I've ever come across a project where everyone said that's a perfect form of engagement or consultation. But I guess a little bit in terms of, I'll just pick up on a couple of sort of projects that I've done in different places, not just in Newham. So I think, I guess just to begin with Newham, I think it's a particularly interesting place to work because it has such a strong political drive from the current mayor, Roxana Fiaz, towards democratic participation in work. So there are a whole series of initiatives that have developed over the last few years in the borough around putting citizens at the heart of decision making. And so there's been really interesting work over the last kind of 6 months on the creation of a new citizens' assembly, which initially was an invite to around, I think it was 10,000 people across the borough, and then bringing together sort of 40, I think it's an assembly of 40 people who are really working to identify what are the sort of priorities for people locally. And one of the things that's come out of that is the focus on sort of greening the borough, and really that idea of taking what's a small group of people, but that can hopefully sort of be representative and sort of to some extent of the borough in getting into that really detailed conversation of not just consulting, but actually really engaging with the issues. And I guess citizens' assemblies, there's been lots of work done on this across different authorities and places, but it's an interesting example of where you're taking not just a sort of come in, come out engagement, but actually working with a small group of people over a long period of time to engage on detailed issues. And I think that idea of giving the context and equipping people with the understanding to have the conversation, and to then be able to, I think, critically engage with the things that are real constraints, budgetary constraints, the realities of planning. And I guess it's fairly early stage with that work, but there's a lot of evidence from other citizens' assemblies right across the world that that's a much more sort of practical way of asking people to really engage with the issues. And I think that's just an interesting example of where perhaps it's types of engagements like that where it's not come in, come out, it's deeper, it invests more in the people in that conversation to actually be able to sort of bring outcomes out of that. So like I say, that's early days, but I think offers a lot of models to us. I think on that kind of, I pick up another project that I did in my previous work, where I was at the Design Council for several years. And one of the projects that I did while I was there was a public engagement project with central government on the Home of 2030, which is an interesting exercise looking ahead 10 years in the future to say, well, what should the homes of the future look like? And so we ran a programme over several months to engage with people through a series of events, to try and invite a different type of conversation about what those sort of future homes look like. And I think it's maybe an interesting counterpoint, because it wasn't looking at a site and it wasn't aiming to look at a place. So instead it was saying, well, when we think about housing and neighbourhoods and the way that people live, if you take as broad a cross section of people in a conversation for sort of 3+ hours, how can you help those people to articulate not just what you want from a place or your reaction against a place, but to say fundamentally what do you want from a place that you're going to live? And that invites a conversation which is not reactive against, I don't want this in my local neighbourhood, I don't want this happening next to us, and actually starts to have the conversation with that point that Jonny makes of, well, how do you have that conversation with people who don't live there yet? And one of the things that is not that surprising, but that came out of it, is that people care first and foremost about the functional needs of where they live, the functional realities of, is it affordable, does it meet your needs? And also about the sense of agency that people really want in that process. So that was just, I think, hopefully what that aimed to set out is a slightly alternative way of saying, well, you can use these insights from what people fundamentally want to almost act in some ways as a counterpoint to some of those the assumptions that get made by developers of saying that, well, we think this is what local people want, or we think that this is what people want in the home. Well, perhaps it isn't. And so it's sort of about building that bigger picture of insight for that. And I guess I'll just touch on wrapping up. Well, maybe might come back to this, but I guess the other one I was going to flag is a project that I'm doing on the side, which is a community-led housing project of a co-housing community. And so, in terms of what I've noticed through that as a resident and as a client, rather than as a kind of, either from a local authority or the third sector, it's how hard that work is, to have that process, and how much investment you need from people and from a community and a group who want to progress those kinds of proposals. And I think just a reflection that we shouldn't underestimate that if you want that deep conversation, how hard that is for people involved in it. So making sure we know that from the beginning and have that resource. But,
well, thanks, Eleri. I'm setting up a CLT too, and I hear what you're saying on when you're on from the resident point of view. My goodness, thank you. Over to Ian. Have you managed to get the top? We may have to be just hearing Ian. Are you there?
I'm afraid we've lost Ian, unfortunately.
Altogether, we lost Ian altogether.
We've lost him. So there's loads of questions though in.
Yeah. Well, I'm really, you've probably seen me snapping away the questions down the side while you've been taking them. I think they're really, thank you. Do keep adding them in. One that's caught my eye is this issue of paying people to get involved in consultation. Any thoughts about that, panelists? Well, Jonny and Eleri. Jonny, you're nodding your head. Do you want to start?
Yeah, that caught my eye as well. I think we should be open to anything. And I think a few of the people who've been talking about it have sort of pointed out that it may be considered good practice, and you can kind of see the you can sort of see the arguments for it in terms of widening sort of participation across social groups and recognizing that people are giving something up. I think that for me, the counterpoint would be something about how people, the opportunity to sort of get involved in something and to sort of to shape something, I think is a sort of civic, I was going to say duty, but probably about overstretching it. I don't think it is transactional, I guess is my point. And I think, so putting aside any questions of like, who's paying whom and what does that look like, I think those are things that probably could be answered. I think the more fundamental question is it a transactional thing? I think it isn't. I think it's a dialogue. I think everyone has something to gain from it, but equally, I can sort of see that reducing barriers is the really critical thing. I was having a conversation this morning with my colleague, sort of plotting out a sort of a plan for next year on a big project that we're bringing forward with in Cambridge, where the kind of backbone of next year's engagement would be around bringing a group of I think the Citizens Assembly model has been mentioned, but bringing forward a demographically representative group of people who already live in the local area to have a deep and kind of profound dialogue, tackling the issues and in a spirit of real openness and honesty about their concerns and about the proposals, and actually feeling like that's a safe space to raise these things and actually work them through rather than just say, isn't this great? And I think that that's the kind of sort of like looking at how you get people to participate in that, whether it's arranging it at times of day where it's convenient for people, looking really realistically at challenges around people working shifts or childcare, those sorts of things. So I think that I think yes to the spirit of paying people, but I think it might equally be about things like, if we're going to arrange things, maybe we do want to make it on Zoom, if that's going to be easier for people who might otherwise have to, arrange childcare for whatever reason, trying to reduce hurdles that people have to jump over to get into, to have dialogue with you, I think is the critical thing.
Thank you. Eleri, do you want to add anything?
I guess I completely agree with that. And I suppose that I found in some of the projects I've done before where, if you really want to reach the sort of, harder to reach communities and you're serious about trying to make that process inclusive, then actually in some ways you need to offer payment to permit that access. Or sometimes it's as simple as allowing someone, paying for someone's transport or covering time which might otherwise have been spent on a shift, or, that whether you agree with it in principle or not, actually, if you practically speaking want to make that an inclusive process, sometimes you need to offer payment for it. So I think that's an aspect of it where, we can be principled about it, but sometimes if you want to make it serious, you just address it from a pragmatic point of view.
Yeah, I really, so Claire Richards in the chat says payment simply acknowledging that what they have to say is of value. It's symbolic as much as anything else. And actually the whole point of social value is it gives value to things that are not traditionally valued. Caring, housework, all those sorts of things. I think it's really important. So one thing that's come up is, why we talk about community consultation, and we did a lot of feeling out about whether consultation or engagement or what word. And this, in a sense, the project is about finding the right words, because we found engagement was fairly meaningless and tarnished for some people. Consultation, kind of people knew a bit more what it was, but it was also tarnished. So we're fully in acknowledgement that the language needs to change, or we need to shift the way the language is used. So for those who you might want to know that we've got Victoria, who's a researcher working in the background, and she's done an analysis of research papers and used participation, community consultation, engagement, all of these words, and come up with 50 papers have been published since 2020, just in case you wanted to know. So yeah, we're using all the words. It's just in case anybody concerned about that. Keeping the eye on the chat, which is just so fascinating, and I've been photographing again and again. Thank you. There was a really interesting point from Matthew Hardy earlier on about too many straw men saying, I'm not quite sure, I wouldn't like Matthew to come online if he's there to talk about that, but essentially that people in this world of consultation have known all this stuff forever. So my question really to Jonny and Eleri is, why, if we've known it forever, why hadn't things changed? Or are we at a moment, do you think, when we can change things? Eleri, can I start off with you on that one? Is something special in the air, an opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's tricky because, yes, I think I've never found people's views on any of these issues to be terribly controversial. I think it's mostly that, the principles of what good consultation engagement looks like are fairly well agreed, but then how do you actually get people to respond to that? And I mean, it seems that, from, I guess, some of the kind of projects that I've advised on and kind of have looked at from afar, there are so many competing incentives to developers and local authorities, local authorities working under huge time pressure, resource challenges, and developers sort of, balancing that against, and Jonny will come in on this, but balancing it against so many other realities of, the planning process and the, sort of, financial constraints or achieving viability, that it's a challenge to create the space in that to say this is actually a fundamentally important thing which is really valued, and almost set the clarity. And it seems that, for the majority of developers, there's a huge amount of goodwill and positivity about how it can be done, but as soon as it can be, as long as it's set as an expectation, and it seems that some of the proposals about planning reform, and you kind of touched on it earlier, Flora, that we don't quite know what's going to happen with those planning reforms, but actually some of the principles around really early stage sort of involvement in design codes and sort of visioning for local places has a huge opportunity to change that dialogue a bit and sort of front load it. And involve people at a very early stage, which might help shift the culture a little bit about something which is more embedded in projects. But no, it doesn't seem like something people fight about. It seems like something which isn't sufficiently incentivized or encouraged or made normal to make it a fundamental part of the process for a lot of people. So I'm quite sympathetic about it, really. Yeah.
Well, I think what we're finding is really that good housing, good places is very much a cross-party issue, and momentum is developing in that way. I like to think and hope that we are at a special moment when we might actually be able to make a difference. Jonny, do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, we have a planning system which is can be quite binary, where we don't have the sort of continental in some sort of Dutch approach of saying we are going to be building our homes in this space, on this land. That's kind of a state's kind of a civic decision that's made, and then let's talk about what they're going to be like. We have a combative planning system where the stakes are extraordinarily high, because if you're a developer, you can make incredible amounts of money by taking land from being agricultural into housing land. If you're but you have to fight against other developers and other bits of any settlement, all vying for a bit of housing allocation, and all kind of like arguing why their bit of land is the best. It's a system rife for discontent, and on the local resident side, you frankly have a great, if you fight long and hard enough against something, you've got a chance of seeing it off, because you can make you can make life very, very difficult for politicians by launching campaigns, calling it, you know, save this, or, you know, doing, basically being smart about. So basically you have a kind of very, very combative system, which I think is intertwined with the way that we do planning in this country, and it is at the heart of a lot of the problems. So to some degree, I feel like while that is the case, it's quite difficult to kind of consult early, and neighbourhood plans are sort of meant to kind of tackle some of this and do so to varying degrees. But again, as soon as plan making is sort of done, then the spirit of it can become sort of, again, quite reductive, because you get some neighbourhood plan groups who are really like, you know, trying to see things off. And so all of the tools that we sort of think might be the kind of way forward to make everything better always sort of often seem to come back to sort of this kind of rather combative and binary thing. It's risky to consult early because you might get people kicking off about something, and yet it's good to consult early because it's the right thing to do. But the quality of the dialogue often is not great because there's too much vested interest and too much to perceive to win or lose about it. So I think we have fundamental and long challenges about this that become a bit easier once we have decided where we're going to put planning, where we are going to be, when it's a sort of allocated site situation and there's plan support for it in the kind of local plan. Then I think at that point you can sort of have really, you know, positive discussions, because simply at that point you've said the parameters of this site are sort of fixed to a degree. There's a plan that's kind of in place, and now we can talk about the detail. But I think, you know, the other really important thing is that developers, I did see the bit in the chat saying, you know, all of this is like, you know, nothing new here. That's correct, but I think developers have to have a new mindset about it. You sort of have to, I don't think any good consultation is going to be done while people feel that they have control over that process. I think from developers, we need to get a lot better at realizing that we can't control good processes. When we've been in, you know, going into engagement events, the best ones have been where we've gone into them thinking, God, you know, this could go, you know, in a number of different ways. It feels like we're taking a bit of a risk having the kind of dialogue that we're going to invite today. We don't quite know what we're going to get, but we're going to kind of stand up and put our best foot forward and explain who we are and why we're trying to do this. And we're going to try and have a proper conversation. There's a risk element to that, and it's not sort of, you know, it's not stage managed. And I think that developers are hopeless at that, because, you know, you're conscious of the kind of commercial picture, and you kind of want to know what you're going to get out of the conversation. But I think we have to wean ourselves off the idea that we can kind of control these processes, and we have to get better at taking risks and having proper, authentic dialogue with people.
Yeah, thank you, Jonny. And I think we can see developing a kind of the whole world of funding, pension funds, funders, ESR, ESG, the pensions for purpose, local investment is all starting to converge, and I think it's going to make it more attractive to developers potentially to be investing locally in a kind of, and also to be logging and the way that they're doing social value and working with communities. We've got to wrap up. So I'm just so fascinated in taking photographs of the conversation in the corner. Thank you everybody for that. So I'm going to, you ask the trustee kind of question, like, so Ellie, what's the one thing, one super priority you think we got to be keeping in mind in this project, one super priority going forward for community consultation?
Oh, okay. Well, I think for me, it's kind of just continuing from what Jonny's saying, really. But I was just noticing Brian Whiteley's point in the chat, which is around sort of actually not doing periodic consultation, but developing long-term community strategies. And that's, maybe it's not an easy thing, but I think there's a point there which actually, you know, thinking about the project that you're doing and the QOL work, is that this is about building that conversation from the beginning and making it a longer conversation, not one which is a binary one, and that's a shift that actually local authorities and developers and all of those involved in that process can really help to support. And I think tools like the one that you're developing are part of the key to doing that and getting it up front in a longer conversation rather than just reactive and fearful. So that would be my sort of reflection.
Thank you, Ellie. And what about you, Jonny?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the process point as well. Process, not event, seems important. I think the other point, and it relates to that, it's about trust and truth. And, you know, the famous post post-truth or post-trust age that we live in, dialogue is always impoverished when neither side kind of has faith in either the other party or in the evidence that's being put forward. I don't believe the transport model, or I don't believe the evidence of the specialists. We choose to believe something else. So the question is, if you're going to have this kind of longer term dialogue, engagement, participation, involvement, any of those things, if that's a genuine long-term thing, who is the party that kind of holds the space for that? Because much as we try, I don't think it's a space for developers to fully hold, because we have a vested interest and we are one party in that dialogue, but we shouldn't be convening. I don't think developers should be convening civic dialogue. Councils, yeah, maybe they should really be convening and holding a space for civic dialogue, but are they trusted as much as they maybe should be? I don't think they are. And so I think there needs to be some things that sort of like holds that space for continual dialogue and the evidence that supports that dialogue, so that we don't all just get to choose the facts that we believe in about our local circumstances, and that there is a sort of agreed evidence base, and that dialogue is held over a long term. So it's more of a question, is if we all agree that that's really intrinsically important to this, then who is the kind of trusted party, and does there even need to be one that holds all of that together, so that when we as developers or others come forward with proposals or whatever, we can sort of plug into that space that exists, that's safe, where people can voice their concerns, but it's not like binary or incendiary when people disagree with each other.
Wise words, Jonny. Who is the trusted party? You would think that would be the call. Anyway, mutter. I won't continue that. Thank you very much for that, your amazing insights and inputs, and thank you very much to everybody who's contributed so amazingly. I'm going to be following up all sorts of stuff in the panel, really very fascinating. Thank you to Dominique for setting up the event, and thank you to the Quality of Life Foundation for hosting. And I just want to remind everybody to sign up, ccqol.org. Please sign up to keep to keep contact with the project, see where we're going, and to hear about the series of future events that's coming on. And so I hope you just have a very nice lunch, and look forward to reporting back on the progress of this, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much indeed. Bye, everybody.